the unbreakable code. The celestial archive hung in the void between stars, a structure so vast it bent light around its obsidian walls. For 17 million years, the architects had maintained it as the repository of all galactic law, every statute encoded in quantum crystalline matrices that could never be altered, never be questioned, never be defied. Kavri stood before the primary adjudication chamber, his forearms folded in a gesture of supreme confidence. As High Arbiter of the Architects, he had presided over 60,000 legal disputes without a single law being successfully challenged. His silver exoskeleton gleamed under the chamber's ambient light, each facet reflecting the holographic displays that surrounded him like a constellation of absolute certainty. Today's case should have been routine. A minor species from a backwater system was contesting Regulation 447 Alpha, the statute that restricted faster-than-light travel to species with demonstrated neural complexity above the threshold of sentient maturity. The humans, as they called themselves, had been denied FTL licensing for the third time in as many cycles. The law is absolute, Kavri's announced to the assembled gallery, where representatives from 200 species watched with varying numbers of eyes. Regulation 447 Alpha exists to prevent immature civilizations from destabilizing established trade routes and diplomatic frameworks. The humans have failed the cognitive assessment. The decision stands. That was when Mira Castellano stepped forward. She was small by galactic standards, barely reaching the midpoint of Kavri's lowest shoulder joint. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her brown eyes held something the Arbiter had rarely seen in his millennia of service: absolute conviction without arrogance. High Arbiter Kavris, she began, her voice projected clearly through the translation matrix, I'm not here to contest the cognitive assessment. I'm here to demonstrate that Regulation 447 Alpha is based on a fundamental logical fallacy that invalidates not just this law, but the entire legal framework of the Celestial Archive. The chamber erupted. Delegates chittered, roared, and broadcast distress pheromones. Kavris raised one primary hand and silence fell like a hammer. That is impossible, he stated flatly. The archive's laws were constructed by the first architects using mathematical principles that transcend opinion or interpretation. They are derived from the fundamental constants of the universe itself. Mira smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. That's exactly the problem. She activated a data cylinder, and a three-dimensional mathematical proof blossomed in the air between them. Kavris felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: uncertainty. You base your laws on the doctrine of universal constants, Mira continued, the principle that certain truths are immutable across all space and time. But you've made a critical error. You've confused physical constants with social constructs. She manipulated the hologram, and equations began to cascade across the display. The speed of light is constant. Gravitational force is constant. But neural complexity, as a measure of civilization's maturity? That's not a universal constant. That's a value judgment dressed up in mathematical clothing. Kavris leaned forward, his compound eyes focusing intently on the proof. The threshold of sentient maturity has been validated across 10,000 species over millions of years. Has it? Myra's fingers danced through the data. Or has it simply been accepted because no one bothered to check the underlying assumptions? Look here. She highlighted a section of the original law's foundation code. The threshold assumes that cognitive development follows a linear progression. But human neurology proves that's false. We process information through distributed networks, through emotion and intuition integrated with logic. Your test measures us against your cognitive architecture, not against the actual requirements of FTL navigation. She pulled up another display showing human pilots successfully navigating FTL simulations. We don't fail because we're incapable. We fail because your test is designed to measure the wrong things. Kavris was silent for a long moment. Around the chamber, delegates had stopped their protests and were studying the mathematical proof with growing alarm. If the human was correct, if even one foundational principle of the archive was flawed, then the entire structure of galactic law might be built on sand. This chamber will recess, Kavris announced, his voice carrying none of its earlier certainty. I must consult with the Architect Council. As the delegates filed out, Mira remained standing before the display, her proof hanging in the air like a challenge to 17 million years of absolute certainty. She knew this was just the beginning. Behind her, a figure approached. Zek Toramine, a Valorian diplomat whose crystalline body refracted light into rainbow patterns, extended a gesture of respect. You've done something remarkable today, human, Zek said quietly. You've made them doubt. But be warned, institutions this old don't change easily. They fight back. Mira nodded, her jaw set with determination. Then we'll fight harder. The Council's fury. The Architect Council convened in a chamber that existed partially outside normal spacetime, a room where 17 million years of accumulated wisdom and power had calcified into something approaching divine authority. 12 beings sat in a circle of quantum thrones, each representing one of the founding species that had established galactic law when most current civilizations were still aquatic organisms. Cavries presented Myra's proof with clinical precision, but he could feel the temperature in the room dropping with each equation he displayed. Preposterous, declared Thessa Vaughn, her serpentine body coiling in agitation. As the representative of the Sethrak Dominion, she had authored half the legal frameworks governing biological species. This human presumes to understand universal principles better than civilizations that were building Dyson spheres when her ancestors were discovering fire? The mathematical proof is sound, Cavries replied carefully. I've had our quantum processors verify it through 647 different analytical frameworks. The human central assertion holds. We have conflated measurement methodologies with fundamental truths. Oryx, a being of pure energy contained within a geometric lattice, pulsed with irritation. Then the processors are malfunctioning. The archive has maintained galactic stability for epochs beyond counting. That alone validates our legal framework. Does it? The question came from an unexpected source. Lyran Vastos, the youngest council member at a mere 2 million years old, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. His species, the Kael'mar, were known for their philosophical rigor. Or does it simply mean we've been stable because no one has had the courage or capability to challenge us? Stability is not the same as correctness. The chamber exploded into argument. Languages that predated most star systems clashed and merged, translation matrices struggling to keep pace with the fury of ancient beings confronting an impossible possibility, that they might be wrong. Cavries waited until the chaos subsided before dropping his second revelation. There's more. I had my research division examine the human's methodology. She used something they call adversarial analysis, the active search for flaws in one's own assumptions. They teach it to children in their academic institutions. Heresy, Thessa hissed. Laws exist to be followed, not questioned. No, Lyran countered. Laws exist to serve justice. If they fail at that purpose, they should be reformed. He turned to Cavries. What does the human want? Initially, just FTL licensing for her species. But after today's hearing, her legal team has filed 17,000 additional challenges to archive regulations. They're systematically reviewing every law that bases restrictions on cognitive or cultural assessments. The council fell silent. 17,000 challenges. It would take centuries to adjudicate them all, and if even a fraction were successful, the entire hierarchy of galactic civilization would be called into question. We must deny her original petition, Thessa declared. Make an example. Show the galaxy that the archive does not bow to upstart species with clever mathematics. That would be unwise, Cavries said quietly. The human anticipated that response. She's made her proof public. Every law student on 1,000 worlds is now examining our foundational principles. If we deny her petition after she's demonstrated its logical invalidity, we don't look strong. We look tyrannical. Oryx's energy matrix flickered with calculation. Then we offer a compromise. Grant humanity FTL licensing, but only under strict supervision. They get what they want, we maintain control, and the matter ends. It won't end, Lyran said. You don't understand what she's done. This isn't about FTL travel. She's weaponized epistemology itself. She's shown every species in the galaxy that our laws can be questioned, should be questioned. You can't put that idea back in the box. Thessa's eyes glowed with cold fire. Then we remove the weapon. The human Mira Castellanos. If she were to have an unfortunate accident. No. Cavries' voice cut through the chamber like a blade. We are not assassins. We are the guardians of law. The moment we resort to violence to maintain our authority is the moment we prove we have no legitimate authority to maintain. Then what do you suggest, Arbiter? Thessa's tone dripped with contempt. Cavries straightened to his full height. We do what we should have done millions of years ago. We invite challenge. We open the archive's foundational codes to peer review. We prove that our laws are just not because we say so, but because they can withstand the most rigorous scrutiny. That could destroy everything we've built, Oryx protested. No, Cavries replied. It could perfect it. And if our laws cannot survive honest examination, then they deserve to be destroyed. The vote was called. 6 in favor of Kavriza's proposal. 5 against. 1 abstention. By the narrowest possible margin, the architects had chosen evolution over extinction. As the council dispersed, Lyran approached Kavriza in the emptying chamber. You've made powerful enemies today, old friend. Thessa will not forget this. I know, Kavriza said. But I looked into that human's eyes, Lyran. She wasn't motivated by ambition or conquest. She genuinely believes that laws should serve all people, not just the powerful. When was the last time anyone in this council could say the same? Lyran had no answer. The human method. Myra's quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel Prometheus were cramped by human standards, luxurious by the metrics of a species still confined to sublight travel. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by holographic displays showing legal codes from 100 different archive sections, searching for patterns in the contradictions. Her team had grown. What started as a solo legal challenge had become something resembling a movement. 3 other humans had joined her. Yarek Okonkwo, a neurologist who specialized in comparative cognition. Svetlana Resnik, a mathematician who found errors the way bloodhounds found scents. And Marcus Chin, a former military strategist who understood that legal battles were still battles. We've got a problem, Marcus announced, materializing in her doorway with his characteristic lack of ceremony. The Sethrak delegation just filed a motion to have you declared mentally incompetent. They're arguing that your willingness to challenge the archive proves cognitive instability. Mira laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut. Of course they are. What's our counter? Svetlana is drafting a response that mathematically proves the concept of mental competence is culturally relative and therefore cannot be universally legislated. She's actually enjoying herself. Good. Mira pulled up a new display. Because we're going to need that argument for what comes next. I found something, Marcus. Something big. She gestured to a section of code that glowed a faint amber. Regulation 89 Gamma. It governs resource allocation for developing species. According to archive law, any civilization below Class 4 status is limited to resource extraction from their home system only. That's why we've been stuck in the solar system, Marcus said. We're Class 2. Right. But look at the justification. She highlighted a passage. The restriction exists to prevent resource depletion and interspecies conflict. Noble goals. Except the formula they use to calculate sustainable resource utilization assumes that all species expand at a constant rate determined by their metabolic baseline. Marcus leaned in, studying the code. But humans don't expand at a constant rate. Exactly. We boom and bust. We innovate in leaps. We terraform and adapt environments instead of just extracting from them. The archive's model doesn't account for species that actively reshape their relationship with resources. She pulled up Earth's historical data. We went from steam power to nuclear fission in less than a century. Their model says that's impossible, so it classifies our energy curve as anomalous and caps our development rating. How many species are affected by this? Preliminary scan? At least 400. Every civilization that doesn't fit the archive's narrow definition of normal development gets artificially constrained. She stood, pacing the small room. This isn't just bad law, Marcus. It's civilizational genocide through bureaucracy. How many species have been locked in their home systems because they didn't develop according to someone else's timeline? Jarek's voice crackled through the comm system. Mira, you need to see this. I'm patching through a message we just received. A hologram materialized, showing a being unlike anything in the archive's database. Its form was constantly shifting, flowing between states of matter as if physicality itself was optional. My name is Tessara, the being said, its voice a harmony of overlapping frequencies. I represent the Flux Collective, a civilization that exists in the quantum foam between dimensions. We've been monitoring your legal challenges with great interest. Myra's pulse quickened. I've never heard of the Flux Collective. Why isn't your species in the archive? Tessara's form rippled with what might have been amusement. Because we failed the archive's existence verification protocols. According to their laws, beings without fixed dimensional coordinates cannot be considered legally extant. We have been petitioning for recognition for 6,000 years. That's insane, Svetlana breathed, having joined the growing crowd in Myra's quarters. That's the archive, Tessara corrected. Your species has done in months what we could not achieve in millennia. You've forced them to question their own axioms. We wish to join your legal challenge. The Flux Collective will provide computational resources and access to our dimensional mathematics. In return, we ask only that you help us gain recognition as a sentient species. Mira looked at her team, saw the same fire in their eyes that burned in her chest. This had started as a simple quest for FTL licensing. Now it was becoming something that could reshape galactic civilization itself. "Welcome to the team," she said to Tessara. "Let's tear down some impossible barriers." Over the next weeks, Mira's coalition grew exponentially. Species that had been marginalized, overlooked, or actively suppressed by archive regulations flocked to her cause. The Vereen, whose collective consciousness violated individual rights statutes. The Keswick, whose silicon-based biology failed the archive's carbon-centric life definition. The nomads of the dark reaches, who lived in interstellar space and thus had no recognized territorial claims. Each brought their own grievances, their own proof that the archive's laws served power rather than justice. And each time Mira and her team found the logical inconsistencies, the cultural biases disguised as universal truths, the mathematical errors compounded over millions of years until they became indistinguishable from natural law. Kavries watched the movement grow with a mixture of pride and terror. He had opened Pandora's box, and what emerged was more powerful than he had imagined. The human hadn't just found flaws in the system. She had created a methodology for finding flaws, and now every marginalized species in the galaxy was using it. The archive would never be the same. But in the shadows of the Celestial Archive, ancient powers stirred. Thessa Vaughn convened a secret council of those who believed the old ways must be preserved at any cost. If law could not stop the human, perhaps more direct methods would be required. The war for galactic law was about to become very real. The assassination protocol. The attack came during a routine transfer between diplomatic vessels. Mira was crossing through a docking umbilical, a transparent tube connecting the Prometheus to a neutral station where she was scheduled to present her findings to a subcommittee. She was reviewing notes on her data pad when the tube's integrity field flickered. For a fraction of a second, hard vacuum existed where life-sustaining atmosphere should have been. Marcus tackled her backward through the airlock door just as the emergency bulkhead slammed shut. Through the transparent wall, Mira watched the umbilical explosively decompress, debris and frozen atmosphere crystals spinning into the void. "Structural failure, my ass," Marcus growled, helping her to her feet. "That was a targeted electromagnetic pulse. Someone just tried to kill you." Mira's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "Then we need to find out who before they try again." The answer came faster than expected. 12 hours later, a Valorian data broker named Keswick contacted them through encrypted channels. His crystalline body flickered with nervous energy as his hologram materialized in the Prometheus's secure conference room. "I'm risking my existence sharing this," Keswick said without preamble, "but what you're doing matters more than my safety." The assassination attempt was authorized by a faction within the Architect Council. They call themselves the Preservation Cadre. "Who leads them?" Yarrick asked. "Thessa Vaughn primarily. But she has allies. Oryx of the Energy Lattice. Vren the Timekeeper. Possibly others. They believe your legal challenges threaten galactic stability, and they've decided you're an acceptable casualty in the name of order." Svetlana's face went pale. "They're going to try again." "Undoubtedly," Keswick confirmed. "But they're vulnerable. The Preservation Cadre operates outside the Archive's legal framework. If you can prove their conspiracy, you can use it to demonstrate the ultimate hypocrisy, the guardians of law breaking their own rules to maintain power." Mira felt something crystallize in her chest, a cold fury that burned hotter than rage. "Give me everything you have on them. Every communication, every authorization code, every shadow transaction. Already transmitted to your ship's secure server," Keswick said. "But be warned, exposing them won't stop them. It will only make them more desperate. Desperate people do desperate things." After Keswick's hologram faded, the team sat in heavy silence. "We could stop," Yarrick said quietly. "Take the FTL licensing they've offered. Go home. Live to fight another day." "No." Mira's voice was granite. "If we stop, everyone who comes after us stops too. Every species that's been marginalized, every civilization that doesn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable, they all lose hope. I won't do that to them." "Even if it gets you killed?" Svetlana asked. "Especially then." Mira pulled up the data Keswick had provided. "Besides, they've made a fatal mistake. They've given us proof that the Archive's leadership is willing to murder to avoid accountability. That's not just a legal violation. It's the complete moral bankruptcy of their entire system." Marcus was already planning. We need protection. Real protection. These diplomatic guards won't stop a determined assassination attempt. I might be able to help with that, a new voice said. They spun to find Lyran Vastos standing in the doorway, his tall form somehow having bypassed every security system on the ship. I've been following your progress with great interest, the Kalmar Council member said. And I've come to believe that the Archive needs what you're doing even if it destroys what we've built. Especially if it destroys what we've built. He paused. I'm formally resigning from the Architect Council and requesting asylum with your delegation. Mira stared at him. Why would you do that? You're giving up millions of years of power. Because power without legitimacy is just tyranny with better furniture, Lyran replied. And because Thessa's conspiracy isn't the only plot in motion. There are factions within factions, schemes within schemes. The Archive is eating itself from the inside, and you're the catalyst that's accelerating the process. I'd rather help build what comes next than die defending what should have ended long ago. What do you know about the other plots? Marcus demanded. Lyran's expression was grim. Enough to know that we have approximately 6 days before the preservation cadre attempts something much worse than an airlock malfunction. They're planning to use an ancient archive authority called the Sanction of Erasure. It allows the Council to declare an entire species a threat to galactic stability and legally exterminate them. The room went cold. They wouldn't dare, Svetlana whispered. The political fallout would be catastrophic. They're counting on it, Lyran said. They believe that if they show they're willing to exterminate humanity, other species will be too terrified to continue challenging archive authority. Fear is the oldest tool of tyranny. Mira stood, her mind racing through options and outcomes. Then we don't have time for slow legal processes. We need to force a public confrontation. Get everything out in the open where they can't hide behind procedure and bureaucracy. How? Yarrick asked. A smile spread across Myra's face, the kind of smile that made Marcus instinctively check his weapons. We're going to do what humans do best. We're going to improvise, break every rule of civilized debate, and make it impossible for them to ignore us. She turned to Lyran. The Archive has a central forum, right? A public space where any species can petition the Council. Yes, but no one has actually used it in over 3 million years. It's purely ceremonial at this point. Perfect, Mira said. Ceremonial means they can't deny us access without violating their own protocols. We're going to march into that forum, broadcast to every species in the galaxy, and lay out every crime the preservation cadre has committed. We're going to make them choose between being murderers or being wrong. That's suicide, Lyran said flatly. The forum is in the heart of the Celestial Archive. They could kill you the moment you arrive. They could, Mira agreed. But they won't. Because the moment they do, they prove everything I've been saying about them. They'll become the villains of their own story. Marcus looked at her with something like awe. You're betting our lives that they care more about appearances than power. No, Mira corrected. I'm betting that enough of them still believe in the principles they claim to uphold. Even Thessa didn't become a monster overnight. She became one slowly, justifying each compromise with the need for stability. We're going to force her to see what she's become. And if you're wrong? Svetlana asked. Myra's eyes were hard as diamonds. Then we die fighting for something worth dying for. Better that than living in a galaxy where murder is an acceptable tool of governance. The vote was unanimous. In 6 days they would storm the gates of heaven itself. And the galaxy would never be the same. The trial of civilizations. The central forum of the Celestial Archive had not seen a true gathering in over 3 million years. The vast amphitheater, carved from a single quantum crystal that existed simultaneously in 17 dimensions, now filled with representatives from nearly every known species. Thousands of beings, from the microscopic Gen collectives to the massive Titanian world ships, crowded into a space designed for such numbers but long abandoned to dust and memory. Mira stood at the petitioner's platform, a small figure dwarfed by the architecture of ages. But her voice, amplified by the forum's ancient systems and broadcast across 1,000 worlds, carried the weight of inevitability. For 17 million years, she began, you have been told that the laws of the Celestial Archive are immutable, perfect, derived from the fundamental truths of the universe itself. Today I'm going to prove that's a lie. The Architect Council sat in their elevated positions, 12 beings who had shaped galactic civilization since before most current stars were born. Thessa Von's serpentine form was coiled tight, her eyes blazing with barely contained fury. Kavri sat apart from the others, having publicly aligned himself with Myra's faction. Lyran's throne stood empty, a silent accusation. I present evidence of 3 fundamental crimes, Mira continued, her datapad projecting holographic documents that filled the air like constellations. First, the systematic suppression of species that do not conform to arbitrary developmental models. Second, the creation of laws based on cultural bias disguised as universal principle. Third, conspiracy to commit murder to prevent legal accountability. The forum erupted. Delegates roared, chimed, broadcast across electromagnetic spectra, and released pheromone clouds of outrage. But Mira stood firm, waiting for the chaos to subside. Let's start with suppression, she said, pulling up the case of the Flux Collective. Tessara's shifting form materialized beside her, a living impossibility that the archive had denied existence for 6 millennia. The Flux Collective is a civilization of quantum beings. They possess technology that could revolutionize dimensional travel, medical science, and energy production. But they don't exist according to archive law because they can't be measured by conventional spatial coordinates. She displayed the relevant statute. Existence Verification Protocol 12 requires beings to maintain fixed positions in 3-dimensional space for a minimum of 0.7 standard seconds. This law was written by species that exist in 3 dimensions, for species that exist in 3 dimensions. It excludes an entire category of sentient life based on nothing more than the physical limitations of its authors. Thessa finally spoke, her voice dripping with contempt. The protocol ensures that only stable, predictable entities are granted legal rights. Quantum beings are inherently unstable and unpredictable. So are humans, Mira shot back. We exist in a constant state of cellular flux. Every 7 years, nearly every atom in our bodies has been replaced. By your logic, we shouldn't have legal continuity because our physical form is not fixed. Yet somehow we're stable enough to dismantle your entire legal framework. Laughter rippled through parts of the forum. Mira pressed her advantage. But suppression is just incompetence. The real crime is bias. She pulled up Regulation 447 Alpha, the FTL restriction that had started everything. This law restricts faster-than-light travel to species with demonstrated neural complexity above the threshold of sentient maturity. Sounds reasonable. Except the threshold itself is based on a study of exactly 7 species, all of which share similar neurological architecture to the architects themselves. She displayed brain scans showing the vast diversity of cognitive systems across the galaxy. Humans process information through integrated emotional logical networks. The Valorians use crystalline quantum computation. The Vereen function as distributed consciousness across thousands of individual bodies. We're all intelligent. We're all capable of abstract thought and ethical reasoning. But only the species that think like the architects are considered mature enough for FTL travel. The threshold has served the galaxy well for millions of years, Oryx interjected, his energy matrix flickering with agitation. It has prevented chaos and maintained order. It has maintained your order, Mira corrected. Your vision of what civilization should look like. Anyone who doesn't fit that vision gets classified as primitive and restricted, no matter their actual capabilities. She looked directly at the assembled delegates. How many of you have been told you're not ready for technologies you've already invented? How many have been forced to develop according to someone else's timeline? Hundreds of appendages, tentacles, and manipulator fields rose in acknowledgement. But even suppression and bias pale compared to the third crime, Mira said, her voice dropping to a register that made the entire forum lean forward. Attempted murder of a legal petitioner to prevent legitimate challenges to archive authority. She displayed the data Kessex had provided. Encrypted communications between preservation cadre members, authorization codes for the airlock attack, financial transactions routing payment to hired operatives. Every piece of evidence was meticulously documented, verified, and damning. 12 days ago, someone sabotaged a docking umbilical while I was crossing between ships. The electromagnetic signature matches archive maintenance equipment. The timing corresponds with a coded message from Thessa Vaughn to preservation cadre operatives. And the payment for the attempt traces back to a Sethrak diplomatic account that hasn't been used in 600 years, except for 3 transfers in the last month. Thessa rose from her throne, her form expanding to fill the space with fury. You accuse a council member of murder based on circumstantial correlations? This is exactly why immature species should not be granted. I accuse you based on proof, Mira interrupted, her voice cutting through Thessa's rage like a surgical laser. Proof that you conspired to kill me rather than answer my legal arguments. Proof that when faced with a challenge you couldn't refute, you chose violence. Proof that the guardians of galactic law are willing to become murderers to avoid accountability. The forum had gone deadly silent. But here's the beautiful part, Mira continued, and now there was something like pity in her voice. You failed. Not just at killing me but at understanding what I represent. I'm not special. I'm not uniquely brilliant or gifted. I'm just the first person stubborn enough to actually read your laws and check whether they make sense. She gestured to the thousands of beings around her. Every species here has members who could do what I've done. You haven't maintained power through superior wisdom or righteous law. You've maintained it through inertia and intimidation. And now that someone's finally pushed back, your entire system is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Kavri stood, his forearms spread in a gesture of formal judgment. The evidence of conspiracy is compelling. Thessa Vaughn, you are hereby suspended from council authority pending full investigation. Oryx, Vren and any other preservation cadre members will submit to legal review. You're destroying everything, Thessa hissed. 17 million years of stability, gone because you're too cowardly to do what's necessary. No, Kavri's replied quietly. 17 million years of stagnation, ending because we finally found the courage to grow. He turned to Mira. The Council formally acknowledges the validity of your legal challenges. Humanity is granted unrestricted FTL licensing, effective immediately. The Flux Collective is recognized as a sentient species with full legal rights. And we are initiating a comprehensive review of all archive laws, with input from every species affected by them. The forum erupted again, but this time with something like celebration. Species that had been suppressed for millennia saw the bars of their cages beginning to bend. But Mira wasn't done. With respect, Arbiter Kavris, that's not enough. The forum went quiet again. You're offering reforms. That's good. But reforms can be reversed by the next council, or the one after that. What the galaxy needs isn't better laws, it needs a better system for making laws. One that includes everyone it governs, not just the oldest and most powerful. She pulled up a document that she and Svetlana had been working on for weeks. I propose the Concordance, a new framework for galactic governance based on principles of participatory democracy, transparent jurisprudence, and perpetual self-correction. Every species gets a voice. Every law must justify itself through public reason, not ancient authority. And anyone from any world can challenge any statute without fear of retaliation. That's madness, Vren croaked from his throne. You're proposing to replace the wisdom of ages with mob rule. I'm proposing to replace tyranny with democracy, Mira corrected. If your laws are truly just, they'll survive scrutiny. And if they're not, they deserve to fall. Kavri studied the proposed concordance with his compound eyes, processing the implications. It would mean the end of the Architect Council as it had existed. The end of centralized authority. The end of everything he had known for his entire existence. I support this proposal, he said. The vote took 3 days. Species argued, debated, formed coalitions and broke them apart. But in the end, the measure passed by a margin of 63%. The age of the architects had ended. The age of the concordance had begun. The growing pains. The transition from 17 million years of hierarchical law to democratic governance was not smooth. 6 months after the concordance was ratified, Mira found herself mediating a dispute between the Titanians and the Jeunes that perfectly encapsulated the new era's challenges. The Titanians, living worldships the size of moons, had accidentally destroyed a Jeune colony by passing through its spatial coordinates. The Jeune, microscopic collective intelligences that existed as quantum probability clouds, had been occupying the same space without the Titanians being able to detect them. How do you legislate right-of-way when two species literally cannot perceive each other? Marcus asked, reviewing the case file with exasperation. Same way you handle everything in the concordance, Mira replied, pulling up the dispute resolution framework. Get both parties talking, find the underlying interests, and engineer a solution that serves everyone. What emerged was the coexistence protocol, a requirement that all ships carry Jeune detection equipment and that Jeune collectives register their coordinates in a shared database. Neither species loved the solution. The Titanians complained about the equipment cost, the Jeune about privacy concerns, but both agreed it beat the alternative of random collisions. Democracy is messy, Lyron observed, watching the proceedings from his new position as concordance mediator. The architects would have simply declared one species subordinate to the other and ended the matter in minutes. The architects would have created resentment that festered for millennia, Mira corrected. This solution might not be elegant, but both parties helped create it. They have ownership. that matters. But not everyone saw the concordance as progress. Tessa Vaughn had been exiled after her trial, convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and abuse of authority. But exile didn't mean silence. From her refuge in the dark reaches, she broadcast manifestos denouncing the chaos of committee governance and predicting galactic collapse. She wasn't entirely wrong. The first year of the concordance saw legislative gridlock as thousands of species tried to assert their interests simultaneously. The second year brought the resource allocation crisis, when developing civilizations demanded access to materials that established powers considered strategic reserves. The third year featured the temporal rights debate, when species with different perceptions of time tried to create mutually comprehensible legal deadlines. Maybe the architects were right, Yarrick admitted during a particularly grueling mediation session. Maybe civilizations need central authority to function. No, Mira said firmly. They need time to learn how to govern themselves. We're trying to compress millions of years of political evolution into a handful of years. Of course it's chaotic. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tessara and the Flux Collective, existing partially outside normal time, could perceive patterns in the chaos that linear time species couldn't see. They proposed the adaptive framework, a system where laws were treated not as permanent fixtures but as evolving hypotheses, constantly tested and refined based on outcomes. You're describing the scientific method applied to governance, Svetlana said, studying the proposal with growing excitement. Exactly, Tessara's harmonics confirmed. Every law becomes an experiment. We implement it, measure results, adjust based on evidence. If something doesn't work, we modify or eliminate it. No sacred cows. No unchangeable truths except the commitment to change itself. The adaptive framework revolutionized the concordance. Suddenly, disagreements weren't existential battles but experiments to test. Species could propose solutions, pilot them in limited contexts, and scale what worked. Failure became information rather than catastrophe. Humanity's contribution to this new era went beyond Myra's legal challenges. Human engineering teams, freed from solar system restrictions, spread across the galaxy bringing their peculiar brand of creative problem-solving. They built bridges between incompatible technologies, designed habitats for species whose environmental needs seemed mutually exclusive, and developed translation systems that could handle beings whose communication methods ranged from chemical signals to gravitational waves. You know what I've noticed? Marcus said, 3 years into the concordance era. The galaxy isn't falling apart. It's actually thriving. Trade has increased. Conflicts have decreased. New technologies are being developed faster than ever. It's almost like giving people freedom to innovate leads to innovation, Mira replied with a smile. But the real test came when the first true crisis struck. The void plague, a phenomenon that disintegrated quantum bonds, began spreading through the Perseus arm. It affected different species at different rates. Some were immune, some died within hours, and it moved faster than any containment protocol. The old archive would have quarantined entire sectors, sacrificing billions to save trillions. The concordance did something different. Within 48 hours, research teams from 200 species were sharing data through the quantum network. Human doctors worked alongside Valorian quantum engineers and Sethrak biologists. The Flux Collective provided computational models that existed across multiple timelines simultaneously, testing millions of potential solutions in parallel. The cure emerged not from a single brilliant mind but from a synthesis of approaches no one species could have conceived alone. Human immune system understanding combined with Valorian quantum manipulation and Jeune probability manipulation created a treatment that adapted to each species' unique biology. The void plague was contained in 3 weeks. Under the old archive, it would have raged for years. This is what the concordance was supposed to be, Kavri said, reviewing the collaborative effort with something approaching wonder. Not a replacement for the archive's wisdom, but a multiplication of it. 1,000 different perspectives finding solutions we never could have imagined alone. But Mira knew the real victory wasn't technological. It was philosophical. The galaxy had learned that it could solve its own problems without appealing to ancient authority. They had become, collectively, the architects of their own future. The new foundation. 5 years after the Concordance's founding, Mira stood in what had once been the Architect Council's private chamber. Now it was a public auditorium where any species could propose legislation or challenge existing statutes. The quantum thrones were gone, replaced by a circular forum where every participant sat at the same level. She was here for a ceremonial purpose, the formal dissolution of the last archive regulations and their replacement with concordance law. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, she felt unexpectedly melancholy. Having second thoughts? Lyran asked, appearing beside her with his characteristic silent grace. Not second thoughts. Just reflections. Mira gestured to the empty space where Kavriza's throne had once stood. The architects built something that lasted 17 million years. What we're building might collapse in 17 years. Or it might evolve into something we can't yet imagine, Lyran countered. The architects' great sin wasn't creating their system. It was believing their system was the final answer. You've built uncertainty into the Concordance's foundation. That's not a weakness. It's wisdom. The chamber began to fill with delegates. Not just the traditional diplomatic corps but also scientists, artists, engineers, philosophers. The Concordance had expanded the definition of who deserved a voice in governance, and the results were as chaotic as they were energizing. Kavriz entered last, his silver exoskeleton showing the wear of years spent traveling between worlds, mediating disputes and helping species transition to the new system. He had aged in ways that went beyond physical deterioration. He carried the weight of having voluntarily dismantled his own civilization's legacy. "Are you ready?" he asked Mira. "To destroy the last remnants of the archive?" "I was ready 5 years ago." "No," Kavriz said gently. "Are you ready to let go? You've been fighting for so long. Fighting the archive, fighting resistance to the Concordance, fighting entropy itself. But today the fight ends. Today the work of governance passes to everyone, including to species that will make decisions you disagree with." Mira felt the weight of his words. She had spent 5 years as the de facto architect of the new system, her moral authority giving weight to her opinions even without formal power. But sustainable democracy couldn't depend on moral authority. It needed institutions that could function without heroes. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The ceremony was brief by galactic standards. Kavriz formally declared the archive's legal code obsolete. The assembled delegates ratified the final Concordance charter. And then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, Kavriz announced his own retirement. "I am the last of the architects who believed our role was to rule," he said to the hushed chamber. "My colleagues have either joined the Concordance as equals or, like Thessa, chosen exile. I have served as transition facilitator, but my continued presence risks creating a new hierarchy based on deference to the old. The Concordance doesn't need wise elders. It needs engaged participants." He turned to Mira. "And neither does it need saviors. You've done something remarkable, Mira Castellanos. You've made yourself obsolete. That's the highest achievement of any revolutionary." Mira wanted to protest, to argue that there was still so much work to do. But she understood what Kavriz was really saying. The Concordance would only succeed if it could function without them. If every species took ownership of its governance rather than deferring to heroic figures. "What will you do?" she asked him. "Explore," Kavriz said, a note of genuine excitement entering his voice. "For 17 million years, I've been so focused on maintaining order that I forgot to experience wonder. I think I'd like to remember what that feels like." Over the following months, Mira watched the Concordance stumble, argue, occasionally fail, and slowly learn to walk on its own. She took on a new role as professor of comparative law at the first truly pangalactic university, teaching students from 100 worlds how to find the hidden assumptions in legal codes, how to question authority respectfully but relentlessly, how to build systems that serve justice rather than power. Her most promising student was a young Sethrak named Vess, who reminded Mira uncomfortably of herself at that age. Brilliant, angry, and absolutely convinced that the Concordance wasn't doing enough to address historical injustices. The species that benefited from the archive's hierarchy still hold disproportionate resources, Vess argued during one heated seminar. The Concordance talks about equality, but it's equality of opportunity in a race where some participants start miles ahead. That's not justice. "You're right," Mira agreed, earning surprised looks from the other students. The Concordance ended legal discrimination, but it didn't erase the material consequences of millions of years of exploitation. "So what's your proposal?" Vess laid out an ambitious plan for resource redistribution, enforced technological sharing, and accelerated development programs for suppressed species. It was idealistic, probably unworkable in its current form, and exactly the kind of thinking the galaxy needed. "Present it to the forum," Mira said. "Argue for it. Fight for it. And when people push back, and they will, listen to their concerns. Find the legitimate objections buried in the self-interest. Iterate. Evolve. Make your proposal better. And if it fails? Then you learn from the failure and try again," Mira said. "That's the Concordance. Not a perfect system but a system that can become more perfect. Not wisdom from on high, but wisdom earned through collective struggle. 10 years after the Concordance's founding, Mira received an unexpected visitor. Thessa Vaughn, once the most powerful being in the galaxy, now a thin shadow of her former self, appeared at the university requesting asylum. "The dark reaches have gotten darker," Thessa said without preamble. "The species there, the ones we exiled from civilized space for being too dangerous or too different, they're organizing. Building their own alternative to the Concordance. And they want me to lead them because I'm a symbol of resistance to your new order." "But you don't want to," Mira observed. "I spent 5 years in exile plotting revenge," Thessa admitted. "Composing manifestos about the Concordance's inevitable collapse. Waiting for the chaos to vindicate everything I believed." She paused, something like pain crossing her serpentine features. "But it didn't collapse. It grew stronger. Not despite its messiness but because of it. And I realized that I've been wrong about everything for a very, very long time." "What do you want from me?" Mira asked. "Forgiveness," Thessa said simply. "I tried to have you killed because I was too arrogant to admit that a species I considered primitive might be right. I don't deserve forgiveness but I'm asking for it anyway." Mira studied the being who had once ordered her assassination. She should feel anger, hatred, the desire for retribution. Instead, she felt only a weary understanding that Thessa was exactly what the old system had created. Someone so invested in hierarchy that any challenge to it felt like existential threat. "I forgive you," Mira said, "on the condition that you use whatever time you have left to make amends. Share your knowledge of how systems become corrupt. Help the next generation avoid the mistakes you made." Thessa's eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. "I accept." The addition of Thessa to the university faculty was controversial. Protests erupted. Victim advocacy groups demanded her permanent exile. But Mira stood firm, arguing that a society committed to growth had to allow for redemption. "We can't build a better future if we're constantly punishing the past," she told the university's governing council. "Thessa did terrible things. But she's also the best qualified person in the galaxy to explain how institutional power corrupts. That knowledge has value, even if its source is tainted." The council agreed narrowly. Thessa joined the faculty as professor of institutional pathology, teaching seminars on how well-intentioned systems drift toward tyranny. Her students were often the harshest critics of her past actions, which made her a better teacher. 20 years after she first challenged the archive, Mira stood before the Concordance's Central Forum one last time. She was older now, gray threading through her dark hair, the weight of 2 decades of relentless work showing in the lines around her eyes. But her voice still carried the steel that had toppled empires. "I'm announcing my retirement from public life," she said to the assembled delegates. "Not because the work is done, it will never be done. But because the most important part of my work is ensuring that it can continue without me." She gestured to the chamber filled with beings from across the galaxy. 20 years ago, I stood in a similar room and accused the architects of building laws that serve power rather than justice. Today, I see a system that's messy, argumentative, sometimes inefficient, and occasionally infuriating. It's also the most just framework for galactic governance that has ever existed. "The Concordance will make mistakes," she continued. "It already has. It will pass bad laws, make wrong decisions, and sometimes fail the very people it's meant to serve. But unlike the archive, when it fails, it can admit the failure and change. That capacity for self-correction is more valuable than any perfect law could ever be." She looked out at faces, forms, and energy patterns representing 1,000 different species. "The humans have a saying, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. That's your job now. All of you. Question everything. Challenge assumptions. Demand accountability. And when you see injustice, don't wait for someone else to fix it. Be the person who stands up and says, 'This is wrong and I'm going to make it right.'" The architects called what we've done impossible. They said civilizations couldn't govern themselves, that without hierarchy there would be only chaos. We've proven them wrong. Not by being perfect but by being committed to getting better. She stepped back from the podium. "Thank you for letting a stubborn human from a Class 2 civilization rewrite your laws. May the laws you write next be even better." The applause started small and built to a roar that shook the quantum foundations of the chamber. Delegates from 1,000 worlds stood in unified acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. But Myra's favorite response came later, in a quiet conversation with Vess, who was now leading her own movement for economic justice across the galaxy. "You know what you did, right?" Vess asked. "You didn't just change the laws. You change what laws are for. The architects built laws to maintain order. You built them to promote justice. That's the real revolution. I didn't do it alone, Mira corrected. I just asked the first question. Everyone else asked the next 1,000. Then I guess I'd better keep asking, Vess said with a grin. Mira retired to Earth, to the house she'd purchased with her first paycheck from the university. She spent her days writing, teaching occasional virtual seminars, and watching humanity spread across the stars with the enthusiasm of a species that had been caged for too long. Yarek sent updates about new biological discoveries. Svetlana about mathematical proofs that were revolutionizing quantum engineering. Marcus about the Concordance's security protocols and the eternal struggle against those who would use freedom as cover for oppression. And Kavries, now hundreds of light years away exploring the Rim territories, sent occasional messages about the wonders he'd found. Species living in the photospheres of stars, civilizations that communicated through gravitational waves, gardens that grew in the quantum foam of spacetime itself. You were right, his most recent message said. I spent so long maintaining order that I forgot why order matters. It's not an end in itself. It's a means to let people thrive. To give them the security to explore, create, and become more than they were. Thank you for teaching an old architect that even fundamental truths can be questioned. On the 50th anniversary of the Concordance's founding, the Galactic Forum passed a resolution naming the new era the Age of Questions. Not because all questions had been answered, but because asking questions had become the foundation of civilization itself. The resolution's preamble included a quote from Myra's first speech to the archive. Laws should serve all people, not just the powerful. Mira read the news on her datapad while sitting in her garden, watching Earth's sunset over mountains her ancestors had never dreamed of climbing. She thought about the scared woman who had stood in the archive's chamber 25 years ago, armed with nothing but logic and conviction. She thought about all the people who had joined her cause, each adding their own piece to a movement that had transformed the galaxy. But mostly she thought about the future. About the students who would find flaws in the concordance that she'd never noticed. About the species who would propose solutions she'd never imagined. About the next generation who would look at the Age of Questions and say, this isn't good enough, and make it better. That was the real victory. Not that she had rewritten galactic law, but that she had made it possible for anyone to rewrite it. The architects had built a monument to their own wisdom. Mira had built a laboratory for everyone's growth. She smiled as the last light faded from the sky, content in the knowledge that the impossible had become merely difficult, and the difficult had become routine. Somewhere in the galaxy, someone was asking a question that would change everything. And that was exactly how it should be.